Welcome to Bible Analysis, and today we're going to cover Genesis chapters 4 through 9 from the fall to the flood. Genesis 4 begins the second great epoch of human history, first, of course, being from creation and what is called the fall of man, and God had given Adam and Eve dominion over all the earth, but the serpent conned them out of it. Treachery and death would be the common experience for all their progeny, and Cain and Abel would be the pattern of violence and victimization. But first, we need to take one more look about the claim about the serpent seed theory. Some claim that the Dead Sea Scrolls cite Satan as Cain's father, but this is an argument from silence. We can see here that there's a lot missing from the Dead Sea Scroll passage, in this passage in Genesis. And this is not the only place there's a section missing. In this case, from Genesis 3:15 to 4:1 is all missing, which includes everything God said to the man, woman, and serpent. So to only take the fact that 4:1 is missing is any kind of significance is cherry picking, because by skipping that verse, it by silence can seem to indicate that directly from the serpent to Cain, and that just isn't true. All right, so enough about that. Now let's go on to reading the first section, that being Genesis 4:1 through 7. And Adam was intimate with his wife Eve, who conceived and gave birth to Cain, and said, God has given me a man. Later she gave birth to his brother Abel. He grew up to be a shepherd while Cain worked the land. And then starting in verse 3, at the appointed time, Cain brought a sacrifice to the master from the produce of the land, but Abel brought the first and best of his sheep. God looked favorably on Abel and his offerings, but he did not accept Cain and his offerings. So Cain was extremely disturbed and became depressed. But the sovereign God said to him, why are you dejected and depressed? Isn't it still a violation if you brought a sacrifice but not your best? Calm down, it's being returned to you so you can decide what to do. Now you already notice that it reads a little bit different considering other ancient texts besides the Masoretic, which, as we know, the Masoretic postdates the New Testament. It may or may not have anything to do with the original Hebrew, but we have the Septuagint and other so-called witnesses to help us figure this out. But the first thing we see in this chapter is that children began to be born, the first of whom was Cain. Recalling the debunking of the serpent seed theory, it states clearly in verse 1 that it was Adam, not the serpent, who fathered Cain. Some claim that the serpent fathered Cain and his bloodline was what Jesus meant in John 8:44 when he told some people that they were of their father the devil. But not only does the context there clearly speak of spiritual matters rather than genetics, verse 1 here explicitly states that Cain's father was Adam. Another question to address here is the claim of some pre-Adamic race that was wiped out between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, since when Cain later went to a distant city and married, there had to be a prior civilization for him to go to. But as we saw before, Romans 5:12 says that sin entered the world through one man, that being Adam, and if there had been a pre-Adamic race or unnamed children from Adam and Eve before they sinned, any who lived before that would be sinless and probably immortal, since none of them would have been part of God's curse or driven out of the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve certainly had many other children after Cain and Abel who were simply not mentioned because they weren't key personages in the Bible's overarching theme and purpose. And if anyone objects to the practice of what we now call incest, which had to be the case when the human race was just beginning to multiply, such a law was not yet given nor needed. The reason God would later prohibit it is because of the errors in our genome that had built up by then. So now God's conversation with Cain is going to be significantly different in the Greek compared to the Hebrew. But either way, it's the first failed attempt at persuasion or witnessing, we would say as Christians, and no less than God who was rejected. The Hebrew text has God saying to Cain that sin was crouching at the door, but Cain would need to master it. But the Greek text has God telling Cain that he would have his offering returned to him so he could have another chance at doing the right thing. We can only speculate as to the reason for the rejection, but it seems that since the text points out that Abel brought the best he had, then Cain did not. It wasn't that Cain didn't bring an animal, but that the produce he brought was of inferior quality. Admittedly, the original languages are difficult to follow here, but this interpretation makes better sense of the immediate context, though most seem to view it as the reason for what happens next. So now let's look at chapter 4, starting in verse 8 through 16. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." After they got there, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the sovereign God confronted Cain. "Where's your brother Abel?" "How should I know?" he retorted. "I'm not his guardian." "What have you done?" the master demanded. "Your brother's blood shouts to me from the ground. So now you are banished from the earth that opened up its mouth to take your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground and it no longer yields good produce for you, you will be miserable and weak." Then Cain replied to the master, "My crime is too great for me to be forgiven. But if you banish me from the earth and from your presence, I will hide in misery and weakness on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." "Not so," replied the sovereign God. "Anyone who tries to kill Cain will suffer 7 times as much punishment." So the sovereign God marked Cain so that any who would find him would not kill him. Then Cain left God's presence and settled in the land of Nod across from Eden. What's particularly striking about Cain's retort to God is the dripping sarcasm of not being his brother's guardian. His father Adam failed at guarding Eden, and his mother Eve failed at guarding Adam. That's what she was made to do. He seems to be trying to shirk responsibility for his actions by rubbing in God's face the fact that he, unlike his parents, was not charged with protecting anyone. But just like his father Adam, he shifted blame from himself to God. This attitude was already evident in his prior attempt to appease God with a substandard offering. Of course, God wasn't having any of that, and he pronounced a curse on Cain himself, as opposed to when God cursed the ground on Adam's account. Here again, the Greek wording is significantly different from the Hebrew, which has Cain saying that his punishment was greater than he could bear, rather than that his crime was too great to be forgiven. The Hebrew almost seems to want sympathy for Cain, depending on how you take that. So now let's start reading in verse 17 through 26. Cain was intimate with his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was building a city, and he named the city after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad was the father of Mehujael. Mehujael was the father of Methushael, not to be confused with Methuselah. And Methuselah was the father of Lamech. Lamech took 2 wives for himself. The name of the first was Ada, and the name of the second was Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the first of those who live in tents and keep livestock. The name of his brother was Jubal, which may or may not be related to the word jubilant, but it's significant that it says here he was the first of all who play the harp and the flute. Now Zillah also gave birth to Tubal-Cain, who heated metal and shaped all kinds of tools made of bronze and iron. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, "Ada and Zillah, listen to me. You wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for hurting me. If Cain is to be avenged 7 times as much, then Lamech 77 times. And Adam was intimate with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son. She named him Seth, saying, God has given me another child in place of Abel, because Cain killed him. And a son was also born to Seth, whom he named Enosh. At that time, people began to worship the Lord." First, we see that Cain marries, and we've already addressed the issue of where his wife might have come from, but notice also that women are named, which isn't as common in later parts of the Old Testament. Then there's some genealogy, including some interesting remarks about the originators of things like music and instruments, metallurgy, and raising cattle, but we'll see more about genealogy in chapter 5. Verse 23 begins the account of Lamech, who killed a young man, though it isn't clear in the Greek text whether the young man was killed for wounding Lamech or that Lamech was grieving over the youth's death. But it's interesting that he claimed even more protection for himself than God gave to Cain, though God isn't the one who says so here. He just claims it. The last 2 verses name Seth as another of Adam and Eve's children, and then Seth fathered Enos. Notice that it's been Eve naming the children so far, and that she considered them blessings from God, nothing to do with the serpent. The Greek text differs from the Hebrew in the final sentence. The Greek says that Enos hoped to call on the name of the sovereign God, but the Hebrew says, then people began to call. Either way, the most scholars interpret the phrase to mean worshiping God. That's what it means to call on the name of God. Now, instead of reading through this chapter laboriously, we will just have this handy chart, which I've added some color to point out some duplicate names. So this chapter, like the first, begins with a subtitle saying it'll be on the genealogy from Adam, and some information is repeated from chapter 4 with added details such as ages at which someone else was born and lifespans. But keep in mind that names are often given to more than one person, just as people have always done since then. Notice there are 2 Lamechs and 2 Enochs. This is really important. One Enoch is in the line of Cain and has a great-great-grandson named Lamech. The other Enoch is in the line of Seth and has a grandson named Lamech. This is the Enoch mentioned by Jude 1:14, being the 7th generation from Adam, if you count Adam. Aside from being the father of the longest-lived person ever, Methuselah, this Enoch was taken alive at the age of 365 years to be with God. And the Greek word there for taken, or Enoch was no more, is also found in Hebrews 11:5 when it reports on this same event, and it indicates that he was transported, not simply that he disappeared. So he was taken by God. Many insist that this Enoch wrote books. But not only can no one prove that the words of Enoch were either written or committed to memory before the flood, the earliest written book attributed to him wasn't written until about 300 BC through 100 AD. That's how long it took to complete. And it was included in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but this only proves that it was being written then, not that it came from before the flood. There's a resource link for further reading which shows that this book was never considered inspired scripture, and it contributes nothing necessary for understanding of the things of God, including how a realm was made. And First Enoch, there are 3, also has some, depending on how it's translated, some sections which seem to indicate that Enoch himself would be the promised Messiah, which of course would be blasphemous. So there are many reasons not to give that any more credence. Now, we have here a genealogy chart with the lifespans and ages at which the next generation was born, but there's controversy over some of these ages. This chart is based on the Septuagint, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and Josephus, while the traditional ages are based upon only the Masoretic text, which shortens the lifespans of Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Reu, and Serug by 100 years each. So that's 600 years shorter in the Hebrew Masoretic lifespans than in other ancient witnesses which predate it. Just to make note of that. And this one, when you think about it, makes a lot more sense that grandparents were not frequently outliving their children, grandchildren, and sometimes great-grandchildren. So now let's go to chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. When humankind began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humankind were beautiful. Thus they took wives for themselves from any they chose. So the Lord said, My spirit will not remain in humankind indefinitely, since they're mortal. They will remain for 120 more years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also after this. When the sons of God would sleep with the daughters of humankind who gave birth to their children, they were the mighty heroes of old, the famous men. But the Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind had become great on the earth. Every inclination of the thoughts of their minds was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made humankind on the earth, and he was highly offended. So the Lord said, I will wipe humankind whom I have created from the face of the earth, everything from humankind to animals, including creatures that move on the ground and birds of the air, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. So this chapter 6 is where we first encounter the term sons of God. Many approach the text with the presumption that this cannot refer to angels based on 2 points or claims, that angels aren't physical so they can't mate with people, and what Jesus said in Matthew 22:30, that marriage will no longer apply to the dead because they will be like the angels in heaven. The claim that spirit beings cannot be physical is refuted by Genesis 18, where Abraham is visited by what appeared to be 3 men who ate and drank with them. The context clearly indicates that these men were really a physical appearance of God called a theophany, though God has no physical form, and Jesus would not incarnate for thousands of years after this. One may object that God can only do this and not angels, but Hebrews 13:2 says that some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. To this we could add the account of Balaam in Numbers 22, where God allowed him to see the angel blocking his way, or Luke 24, where the women at Jesus' empty tomb saw two men who gleamed like lightning, and we also can recall the incident where one of the women thought Jesus was the gardener, so he obviously was very human in appearance, or Genesis 19, where the men of Sodom wanted to rape the angels who came to rescue Lot, but they referred to them as men. But in any study of angels, be sure to use discernment. One source states that though angels always appear to people as adult male humans, they only do so temporarily and for our benefit. The point is that they can take on real physical flesh, they can eat and drink as any human. But it also claims that the line of Cain had ungodly women, so we're back to this again. Why the godly men of Seth would choose only the ungodly women of Cain is not mentioned or explained, but this so-called Sethite theory, which developed in the 5th century AD, is disturbingly similar to the debunked serpent seed one. As for the other point referencing what Jesus said, he specified that the angels in heaven don't marry, not the fallen angels, and not by inability, but by choice. Along with asking why only the daughters of Cain would be wicked and the sons of Seth be righteous, why would the children of such unions result in what Genesis 6 describes as giants, who were renowned from ancient times from Moses' perspective? And why would Jude later describe the fallen angels as having left their proper place and chased after quote-unquote strange flesh? The ancient myths of godlike beings, some apparently part animal, likely came from these hybrid offspring of the fallen angels in human, women, and animals. And when they died, being part angel, they would not go to the grave as human souls did, but would wander the earth and become known as demons. This might also explain why demons seem to crave taking over the body of a person or even an animal, and sometimes inanimate objects. At least the argument for sons of God being angels has some support in scripture and history. In verses 5 through 7 and 11 and 12, we see the reasons God decided to flood the earth. Everyone's mind was continually focused on evil, and the earth was filled with violence and corruption. It doesn't say that God did this because there were giants, just to make that point, but because the people have become so wicked. Now we'll look at verses 9 through 13 and skip a few in verses 17, 18. These are Noah's descendants in his generation. Noah was a moral and exemplary man. He walked with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. In God's sight, the earth had become corrupt and was filled with violence. God saw that the earth was corrupt because all creatures behaved corruptly on the earth. God said to Noah, "The end has come for all creatures, since they have filled the earth with violence. I'm now about to destroy them along with the earth." And skipping to 17, "I'm now bringing the floodwaters over the earth to destroy everything under the sky that breathes. Everything on earth is about to take its last breath, but I will set up my covenant with you. You will go into the ark together with your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives." But what does it mean that Noah was found to be perfect in his generations, as a more literal translation would have it? And that's verse 9. Some say that it means he was the only good person of his time, but others claim that it means he was genetically pure, having no mixture with the fallen angels. This idea fits better with the context regarding giants, but it's conjecture, since it's followed immediately by "he walked with God." So the immediate context is giving the idea that perfect in his generation means he was good, a good and moral exemplary man among the people of his generation. And yet, if it has to do, it may be a dual meaning where it also refers to the giants that are spoken of in the same passage. Now, to the building of the ark, because we kind of skipped over some details. There's a resource link to a web archive of a site dedicated to studying the dimensions and seaworthiness of the ark itself, and another to an interesting 3D walkthrough site. Keep in mind that the ark was not built for speed or distance, but simply to stay afloat in rough seas. There's no problem fitting the animals on board, and keep in mind that there would not be a need for every variation within a kind. For example, one pair of wolves could result in all kinds of what we call dogs without requiring millions of years. Compared to the evolutionary fable about life arising from electrified pond scum, the Bible's account is much more believable. So when someone says, oh, you believe that everything came, all the animals survived on a little ark. First of all, they don't know it wasn't little. And second of all, you can tell them you believe life came from a rock or pond scum. Which one do you think is more believable? And also in this picture of the ark, this is an artist rendering, of course, there is a lower fin in the other end of the ark on the back end, and between the two of them, they would deal with wind and wave movement and keep the thing afloat. So it was a well-designed vessel, and there's good evidence that other boats in the future, since this was the first major boat, would be built on this pattern. Now let's look at Genesis 7, 1 through 16. The Lord said to Noah, "Come into the ark, you and all your household, for I consider you godly among this generation." That's the third time we've seen that phrase. "You must take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, the male and its mate, 2 for every kind of unclean animal, the male and its mate, and also 7 pairs of every kind of bird in the sky, male and female, to preserve their offspring on the face of the entire earth. For in 7 days I will cause it to rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the ground every living thing that I have made." And then skipping down to verse 6, Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters engulfed the earth. And then verse 11, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the heavens were open. And the rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On that very day Noah entered the ark." And then verse 16, "Then the Lord shut him in." The Lord shut that door. So this is when God finally tells Noah to enter the ark along with his wife, 3 sons, and their wives. As for the mention of clean animals, remember that Moses is using the word clean during a time when such a term had meaning. All of this preparation likely took place during the 120 years God marked out in 6:3, but now they're told that the rains will come in 7 days when Noah was 600 years old. But the point here in this section is that the clean and unclean animal designations do not serve as a proof that some people like to make that the laws of Moses predated Moses, that they were from the time of Noah. Now, verse 11 states that the fountains of the abyss, or the great deep, were broken up, and the torrents, or floodgates, to release them, of the sky were open. The traditional interpretation that the torrents of the sky simply refers to rain, but we can't rule out a supernatural release of at least some of the waters above the sky that we learned about in Genesis 1. The objection to this view is that there could not possibly be waters coming from beyond the stars to the earth, because remember, the stars and luminaries, the sun, moon, and stars, are in the firmament, but the waters are above. Yet who is to say that the stars are that big and far away? Few are aware of just how much guesswork and imagination goes into what is passed off as the science of cosmology or astronomy. And we should ponder the question of how the surface of the ball could flood. Now let's go on to chapter 7, verse 17 through 24. "The flood engulfed the earth for 40 days. As the waters increased, they lifted the ark and raised it above the earth. The waters completely overwhelmed the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the waters. The waters completely inundated the earth so that even all of the high mountains under the entire sky were covered. The waters rose more than 20 feet above the mountains." And just to stop and say, there were mountains before the flood, so mountains can't all be accounted for because of post-flood geology. Now back to verse 21, "And all living things that moved on the earth died, including the birds, domestic animals, and wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all humankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died." So notice the breath of life is also in the animals on the surface of the earth. Verse 23, "So the Lord destroyed every living thing that was on the surface of the ground, including people, animals, creatures that creep along the ground, and birds of the sky. They were wiped off the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark survived. The waters prevailed over the earth for 150 days. Now notice that verse 19 states that the ark was lifted by the waters over the top of the highest mountains, though we can't be sure how they compared to mountains as we know them. There were mountains, but we don't know their topography. Since the waters below ground were released by it being broken up, the landmass and everything on it was likely to be changed in significant ways, which could be some ancient way of indicating what is now believed to be plate tectonics, but that is highly in dispute as well, but it explains a lot. The fossil record and the layers of strata in which they're found are best explained by the processes of floods, including the rapid deposition of silt and other debris, which is required for fossilization. You have to have rapid burial. Smaller creatures would be the first to die, while larger ones would get to higher ground at first, and explains why smaller, simpler creatures are found in lower rock strata. And if it had only been a local flood, people and animals could simply have fled to higher ground elsewhere. Flood geology is a much more straightforward explanation than any gradualistic story for what we observe in what's called the fossil record. The issue of flood aftermath and why evolution is a fable are beyond the scope of this lesson or writing, so please visit the link Science Against Evolution for details, and there are many other good sites as well. And the YouTube channel called Wise Up has evidence of the level of technology that was wiped out by the flood, which of course was the flood's purpose. Much of what we've been told is alien rock cutting or people wearing out simple copper tools to carve rocks with great skill is really, according to him and convincing evidence, just wood, straw, concrete, metal, and other materials buried under salt water for a year or more while the earth went through violent changes. So there are other explanations. Always remember to ask those questions. Now let's go on to chapter 8. And for this, we're just going to give an outline. First of all, God causes a wind to blow over the waters to make them recede. Then he closes the fountains of the deep and the floodgates of heaven, so above and below. It takes 150 days for the land to reappear. The ark lands on the mountains of Ararat, plural, mountain range, on the 17th day of the 7th month. It takes until the 10th month for the mountain tops to reappear. After 40 days, Noah opens a window and sends out a raven. Then he later sends out a dove, but it takes another 14 days till the dove stops returning to him. Noah is 601 years old when he removes the ark's roof, and by the 27th day of the 2nd month, the earth is finally dry. So God tells them to leave the ark, and then Noah builds an altar to God and sacrifices clean animals as an offering, and then God promises to never again flood the whole earth, and that the seasons and days will continue as long as the earth exists. Notice he didn't say he wouldn't destroy it by any other means, but simply by flooding. But until the very end, there will be seasons and day and night cycles. So this chapter reports on the end of the great flood, which according to verse 13 lasted about a year, and Noah builds this altar to God and sacrificed some of the clean animals. This is when God made the first covenant or promise, since only God was obligated to do anything. That's a unilateral contract. And this covenant was with all people for all time. God promised to Noah that he would never again wipe out the earth with water, though in 2 Peter 3:7, he is where he says he will wipe it out in the future with fire. Until then, God is again promising that the seasons and days will continue. So the thing is that this unilateral contract is with all people, and some people refer today to a Noahide law. This is not what it appears. We immediately would think of this passage in Genesis, but what they mean by it is much more, and it includes blasphemy laws, which would make every Christian guilty of blasphemy and worthy of death. Just to let you know that that's a prophetic event coming soon. Now we'll do another outline for chapter 9. It says, animals would now be afraid of people who would be allowed to eat them. Those two things are related. But meat eaten must not have blood in it since it represents life. That's important, represents life. If any person or animal takes a human life, that person or animal must pay with its own life. This is directly from God. God confirms his covenant with both people and animals to never flood earth again, marked with the rainbow as a seal. Noah plants a vineyard. He gets drunk on the wine, but his son Ham sees him naked and mocks him to his brothers Shem and Japheth, who cover him up without seeing him. It says that they put cloth on their shoulders and walked backward into the tent and dropped it on their father so they wouldn't see him. More about that later, of course. Noah plants a vineyard. I read that twice in my notes. Noah curses Ham's son, Canaan, but blesses Shem and Japheth. And then Noah lives another 350 years after the flood for 950 years total. So, this chapter explains why animals seem to have a natural fear of people, because God commanded it. And this is, as I hinted before when I was reading, this is because they would be humans' food, and so there had to be some kind of balance in the equation here. And keep in mind that God is blessing Noah, and the eating of meat is part of that blessing. God further commanded that if anyone, human or animal, takes a person's life, that human or animal must pay with its own life, because people are made in God's image. That's the reason. And as God's habit is throughout the scriptures, he puts a seal on this covenant with a sign, the rainbow. Verse 20 begins the account of Noah and his son Ham. Some commentators interpret the incident to mean that Ham actually violated the body of his drunken father, while others only take what's actually said in the text, though pointing out that an accidental glimpse of his father's body would not in itself be sinful. So they think that Ham went out and mocked his father to his brothers at the very least. But why is it that when Noah became sober and found out what happened, he cursed Ham's son, Canaan, rather than Ham himself? Scripture doesn't tell us, and we have to be careful when it doesn't tell us. But perhaps it was because the son of Noah would suffer the experience of having a wicked and cursed son of his own. A good breakdown of this chapter can be found at a link in the resources for Enduring Word Commentary. So you might want to check that out. It has much more detail. That's the end of this lesson, and we'll see you in the next one.